It's Friday, and I'm back with the next in my Fanzine Friday series. Today we're taking a look at Demonsblood number 3. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, I take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf for a closer look. Today, that's Demonsblood number 3. It comes to us from the UK in the summer of 1979. Hope you enjoy today's video. So we continue our look today at the fanzine called Demonsblood, put together by Brian Dolton. As I've mentioned before, this is heavy stock cover folded in half, paper folded in half and stapled. And it's sort of a more of an APA type fanzine where contributors send in 2, 3, 4 pages of their material. He collates it all and puts it together under one cover. Speaking of cover, this is a new artist today. Our cover artist is Simon Robbins, and you can see there he's got a sort of a soldier warrior up on a high bluff, and he's got a sword in one hand, another sword in his belt. These aren't dated, but it looks like this one's coming out in the summer of 1979, and he has a table of contents which I've reproduced here. Bestial Growls is his personal editorial. He talks a little bit about the fact that they've been slow in producing, and so going forward he's going to move to a every other month format, which gives him more time to get the product out on time. He's hoping to increase it from 32 pages, which this is, to 36 the next time. Says he's got lots of contributions of material, so much so that he's telling folks, please don't send in a new article unless I've published your first article. He doesn't have a lot of artwork other than what he's getting from Paul Blackwell, who he says does a good job, and I would agree. I like Paul's art. So he is encouraging people to continue to send in articles, but also to send in more art for the fanzine. Mysteries of Mintier is a postal D&D game. We'll talk about that in specifics. Werewolf Comments is Brian Dolton's. He calls himself the Beast. It is his personal fanzine this time, which he says would be number 3, but this one he's only calling 2.5 because it's so brief. And basically all he mentions is he's encouraging people once again to go to this event called GordyCon. He says he'll be there and hopes to see people. Gives some information about where it's going to be, and mentions that Games Workshop also is giving out some Games Day awards and encouraging people to send off and get a nomination slip so that they can contribute their opinions for that. The Killing of Thomas Clibb is fantasy fiction, and it's a story about an elf with a wooden leg, a gnome, and 2 orcs, and they're pretty violent. They come into town, go into a crowded bar or tavern, see a guy who has a symbol of Loki around his neck. I guess they don't like Loki, so they go to the rooms, put on their armor and swords, come back down and try and kill him, chase him through the town, eventually kill him, and that's sort of where the story ends, as the people from the town are after them, because it turns out he was a very important person in the town. So we'll see, maybe there's more of that in future issues. Ravencroaks is a fanzine. Quaestor is a fanzine. Chronicles of Kawar is a fanzine. Ichor Transfusion as well. We'll talk about all those in a little more detail. Reviews come to us from Paul Blackwell, and he talks about a fanzine called The Apprentice from Canada. We're going to talk about his review in a minute. Things That Go Bump in the Night, New Monsters, and the Carrier character file, which are new NPCs. And we'll mention that one because this one has a bit of a theme. It's all done by one contributor. So if you let me get out of the way here in a second, and then I'll just let you guys see the contributors for this episode. Brian Dolton's the editor. Paul Blackwell contributes an article and art. Simon Robbins does the cover art. As far as I can tell, that's all he does. And then the rest of these folks are all contributors, either of fanzines within, the little mini fanzines within this issue, or contribute some some monsters to the things that go bump in the night. Okay, so this is the Mysteries of Mintir, and it is a postal D&D game that's appearing. He mentioned this in a prior issue, whether folks might like this. And so essentially what he does is gives you a little background, and let me read that to you because it's very dramatic. In the beginning there was chaos, but even chaos must generate order, and the world, thus the world was born to perish. In this decline of law, which is but temporary, the chaos-tainted world declined. Chaos-tainted world declined. The world has always been. To exist is to be balanced. The world was moved from another continuum by the alien gods who constructed the orb, the life giver in the sky, who wait for one such as Reigen, but different, who will lead the world in their way and destroy the blasphemous Reigen. He's a powerful archmage. Considered the savior against the aliens who created the earth for organisms to develop into warriors for a future war of immense proportions. And that's his intro. And it's he talks about it a little bit. There's a world, he says, like the Mediterranean Sea. It's warm. There's basically islands with a coastline to the north, which is known to be a land of barbarians. And so people start in this large central island. He gives you a little bit of information. He suggests you should roll up some pre-rolled characters, a maximum of 3. And he says in here, monks won't fit in my world, so can't use monks. And you essentially send off and get some information from him, and then he will start sending you. He'll send you the form, and you sit in and sort of send in your directions or orders, and everyone does that. And then I think in future fanzines, he'll sort of tell you what has happened based on the actions of the people that are participating in the postal game. This first one here is called The Raven, this first mini fanzine that's in here, The Raven Croaks. It's a first-time contribution from Andy Ravenscroft, and I've communicated a couple times with Andy. He has some connections to several of the folks who are involved with fanzines over there in the UK. Really great guy, and so I was really excited to see that he had a contribution. He says this is his first contribution to a fanzine, but certainly not his last. And wanted to share some of his information, and the thing that he has here is he says he's been doing a number of tables, and this time he's sharing his table for fall damage. He said he found that the D&D version a little too simplistic, that the idea that by dice rolls you might actually end up falling a decent distance but not being particularly hurt, which seems unrealistic if you fall very far. And so he's got a table. We look at making a roll against dexterity, penalties for heavy armor or being encumbered, and then there's a chart here at the bottom that starts with 5 feet and goes all the way down to 50 feet. Starts, and he has various things that can happen. Starts with spraining of an ankle or wrist, breaking an ankle or wrist, breaking a limb, breaking your neck, breaking your back. And as you fall farther, the chances of these things are increased to the point where if you fall over 50 feet, you've got a high probability of some very serious damage. He also covers what to do, how the effects of being, for example, having a sprained wrist or ankle or broken limb would affect you in terms of combat and movement, the inability perhaps to be able to cast spells and so on, as well as how clerical healing spells should be interpreted and used to mend or get rid of those effects, and which spells you'd have to cast based on how severely hurt someone might be. He points out that Dragon Magazine number 22 had finally published some of the charts that will be in the upcoming DM's guide, and encourages people to go out and sort of get the sneak peek if they want to learn a little bit more about some of the charts that are coming up in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And he's got a couple of cool, he's got a cool trap and a cool magic item. So his trap is, you come to a pair of doors that require a knock spell to open. And then you go in, and as soon as someone goes in, the doors slam back shut, which will require another knock spell to open. The person who's in there sees the ceiling it's a square room, and the ceiling begins to descend. You're going to have just a few rounds to make a decision. As he says, you probably don't have 2 knock spells memorized, and that's part of the point of this trap. There are doors on the far side. So you either someone has to figure out how to get you back through the doors before you get crushed, or you have to go through the other doors, which are unlocked. And there's a monster, he says, based on the level of the characters you would scale up the monster that's back there. If you can fight and defeat the monster, you can push into that room. The ceiling will come down and go back up, and now you're safe. But if not, you're going to get squashed and killed. And then his magical item is called Hellfire. It is something a magic user or alchemist could create using tongue of a red dragon or a hellhound, some demon's blood. But anyway, it will react with air. So I guess the finishing touch must be when you enclose it, right? Because otherwise it would explode immediately. So you throw it. It's in a glass vial, probably. When you throw it, when it is exposed to air, it explodes into a 10-foot radius and does a lot of damage to creatures unless they're protected against magical fire. And then he mentions here at the bottom that his local group puts out a magazine called Shire Talk. I think I have one episode or one issue of that. So I'm going to pull that off the shelf and take a look at it. But Shire Talk, which is a zine that covers a lot of different issues around role-playing games. Okay, so Andy says his artwork in his mini fanzine is by I believe it's Rua Plumridge and Quentin Manley. So let's take a look at that. So Rua does the symbol for his little logo of the raven, and then Quentin does the other two. So the first one here is this snake with its head chopped off, and the second one is this fantastically monster. I was excited because I thought Andy was going to have a new monster for us in his fanzine, but he did not. But this thing's awesome. So somebody needs to come up with stats for this creature because I just love it. Here's our next one. This is Quaestor, and this is by Andrew Key. He gives some feedback about the various fanzines that were in Demonsblood number 2, and then moves on to what he wanted to write about, which was his research and his tables for ambidextry. He says he's done some research about that, figured out how often it is, and then he's got suggestions on how to use that in your campaign. And so he's got a D100 roll with some modifiers. You're a little more likely, if you're female, get an extra bonus for every point of dexterity over 12. Elves get a nice bonus. Half elves get a half of that nice bonus. And then you roll to see if you're left-handed, right-handed, semi-ambidextrous, or ambidextrous. And he's got modifiers for using things in the wrong hand. And obviously, it's a little better if you're semi-ambidextrous, and a lot better if you are truly ambidextrous. And so that's well thought out. Then he talks about Runequest, which is, he says, his favorite game, although he's complaining here about the actual ruins that they use, saying that if you look at historical ruins from Old England, if you look at Tolkien's ruins, their ruins, he doesn't like them. They're more squiggly lines and symbols than the sort of straight line type things that he thinks they should have been. And then he talks about his ideas for disarming an opponent, which he says first you have to have rules for parrying, and if you can parry an attack, then you get a roll essentially to disarm the other guy or gal's weapon. He does mention here at the end, Games and Puzzles number 56 has some magic items, miscellaneous items in it that you might want to use. He says, I've read that the deadline to put things into the Fiend Folio has been extended, which means, of course, the publication date is getting pushed back. And he mentions another shop that's out there for gaming. This guy, speaking of ruins, he loves his ruins. This is the Chronicles of Kawar. So I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. From Kevin Reeder. He starts also with some feedback on articles from Demonsblood, in his case number 1, the things he likes and didn't like. And then he goes on to talk about the reason he wanted to write. It's kind of made me chuckle a little. The reason I wanted to write in and do a sort of my own like mini fanzine was to share my combat system I've developed, which is just awesome. But I'm not going to do that in this one. Maybe I'll do that in the next one. And so he says, first I got to give you some background on how I run my game system. This guy says his game sounds chaotic. It's like a mashup of chivalry and sorcery, D&D, AD&D, and other rules and things that he's made up. My biggest complaint about this, if you will, or criticism is it's really complex and sort of hard to follow, because he only gives you sort of like snippets of the way he runs his game. So he talks to you about character creation, and he has this idea where certain stats modify other stats. Like if you have a good intelligence, it gives you a bonus to your wisdom. If you have a good constitution, it gives you a bonus to your strength, and so on. He also says, in this sentence, he says, if you have a good charisma, it gives you a bonus to ego, which I'm not sure what he's doing with that stat. 4 lines later in his own fanzine, he says, however, I've decided to stop using ego, and now I'm going to use charisma plus wisdom for whatever he was doing with that characteristic. So within 4 lines of his own fanzine, he changes his mind from his base rule. That's the kind of stuff that makes me feel like this is a little chaotic and hard to follow. Let's see, what else does he do here? And then he's got this thing that feels like a middle school math problem my son would do. Parentheses, intelligence plus dexterity plus strength in parentheses minus 40 over 5 equals the number of weapon proficiencies you get. I mean, that kind of stuff seems unnecessarily complex to me. That's just how I like to play my game. Now he moves on to the reason he's writing it this time, he says, which is this thing called encumbrance class. And he goes to great lengths to tell you he created this. He's trying to trademark it or copyright it or whatever he can do here within his fanzine to say this is my, this is something I came up with, and nobody's allowed to steal this from me. Probably not going to, and it's because it's so darn complicated. So he's trying to figure out your carrying capacity and the effects it has on you. So he's got these things like your prime requisite, then you've got your strength CC factor, then your constitution CCF factor, then your requisite value, then your strength CCF, and then your constitution CCF. It seems like it's a giant 4-layered, 5-layered math problem because he's got these numbers and modifiers and decimals. Bottom line is you end up with the percent to which you are encumbered, and so you get a number from 2, which is completely basically unencumbered, to a -1 that affects your percentage of movement. So you go from 100% down to negative movement, and it's going to affect, it's not only going to affect how fast you can move, but it's going to have an effect on modifying your rolls in combat. I didn't understand it. I read it twice. That was enough. He also talks a little bit about himself, his background, the different types of games he likes to play. And then he says, if you want more information about the things I've talked about, let me know. Maybe next time I'll put some of this stuff in here. Then he's got another piece to his article. I like this one quite a bit. And this was how to sort of populate your town or village. So he's got 7 options here, from rich, general, weapons area, specialist area, craftsman, information or aid, and then poor. I think that you're supposed to decide for yourself rather than roll. And then depending on which section, he's got tables for each of those where you do give a D100 roll, and it gives you ideas of what would be in the rich part of town, what would be in the poor part of town, etc. And I think it's pretty well done. Reading what type of things he says to put where, I like a lot, and so you get rich merchants and all kinds of fancy temples and stuff like that in the rich section, all the way down to the poor guys. You've got taverns, bathhouses, assassins' dens, thieves' dens, beggars' guild, house for the insane. Anyway, that one I thought was that part of his fanzine was well done. So he just probably needs to work some more, maybe have a little editorial help to sharpen his communication of the ideas he has, I think, because he seemed like he had some good ideas there in the end. Okay, so our next mini fanzine here, JLT Patterson, Ichor Transfusion. This is number 1. And he gives us a little background. He says, I think this is a little bit interesting. He says, I've never read your fanzine, Demonsblood, but I'm sending it to you instead of Troll Crusher because the editor, John Baile, at Troll Crusher is too totalitarian in the way he censors and edits people's things. If I type something up, I want my entire article printed in your fanzine. So here we go. And the reason he's writing in is he's come up with a critical hit table, which was a very popular concept back then. I would take a look at this with you guys. It is way too complicated for me. So I'll do my best to explain it as best as I understand it. And I like this. So he starts out well, I thought. If you exceed your number you need to hit by 10, it's a critical hit, or any 20. It's going to be a critical hit. So I thought that's a good way of thinking about when you can have a critical hit. And then he's got some modifiers. He's got two types of weapons, impact weapons or light weapons. So like swords, axes are impact weapons, some smaller handheld weapons, and bows and arrows, crossbow bolts, etc. are considered lighter weapons. You get some bonuses on these rolls, modifications for the hit dice of the monster, for the level of your character. So for example, a fighter gets a 4% bonus per level, cleric and thief only get a 3%, magic users only 2%. That kind of stuff makes some sense to me as well. Additional bonuses for surprise, and then additional bonuses or negative modifiers based on the type of weapon that you're using, including, like I said, including melee weapons or bow and arrow, crossbow bolts, distance, missile weapons. And then there's also modifiers for types of creatures based on their types of attacks, based on their size, and so to give you a little view. So here's some of the modifiers, right, based on the weapon type. And now we've got the monsters, and then we get the table themselves. If you get the critical hit, you do all this stuff. Now you're going to roll d4 plus 1, multiply this by 10, then roll d10, add this to the other number, apply your modifiers, and then look at the appropriate table below. So it just seems too complicated to do in the middle of combat, I guess is my point, even though it's very well thought out. And as he says, I allow my characters to be strategic. So if you get a 72, you can look on the table, and anything from a 72 or lower, you can choose to make that be what you do with your critical strike. Force somebody back, parried, injured to particular arms, legs, broken arms, damage to their weapons, on and on and on. All the way up to 100 or higher, you can have instant death. So that it's very well thought out. It's very detailed. So in that sense, everything he's got here seems okay to me. It just seems way too complicated when I have 4 pages of charts I have to look through. And notwithstanding his promise at the beginning that once you get used to this, isn't very complicated, it seems really complicated to me. I can't imagine trying to have player characters do this for themselves. The combat would just take like an hour plus, right? And sometimes combat feels like it goes that long anyway. And he has a little note, be aware certain types of creatures can't be critically hit, like a green slime. There's no part of a green slime to critically hit. And so you have to be aware that some things just literally can't take a critical hit. So there we go. Next time, he says, I'm going to do Howard's Serpent Men as a character class, or Bards Revised, How to Be a God, How to Build a Dungeon in Your Attic, or just some more of my normal junk. So I'm looking forward to seeing what this guy does next time. He clearly puts a lot of thought into his mini fanzine. Okay, there's some more, even more results. The reviews, Paul Blackwell does 2 things. One's The Apprentice, which is another fanzine, so I wanted to talk about that. And so he says, look, I read Gary Gygax talk about The Apprentice #2, and he was sort of scathing review. It's kind of famous that Gary just really went off on this guy. He said, I got a hold of a copy of issue #4. He goes, so either this thing got a lot better in 2 issues, or Gary's comments seemed really unfair to me, because he said he liked it quite a bit, thought it was a very good fanzine, talked about the contents of it and so forth. And then Alpha Mega, which is a tactical combat game put out by Ballantine Games, which he really, really likes. And now we've got the things that go bump in the night, which are the new monsters. So we've got the bobolinks, feathered denizens that live in a wooded area, and so they're sort of like birds. And he says they're very shy, but if you get too close to them, then they attack by swooping down. And they've got this scream cry that they can make, and they can cause you essentially to be charmed if you do a character stat roll under your charisma. And if not, you basically will turn and try to defend the birds from your party members or anybody else. That's from Dave Flin. Now we got Simon Washbourne with The Boneless. an amorphous jelly-like creature, gray-black in color, that pulls itself up into sort of a humanoid-looking shape. It can cause fear in low-level folks, and the first time you hit it, you won't score any damage, and it will envelop whoever has hit it. So, unfortunate to go first on this guy, I guess, right? And if you can't get this thing off of your character, it'll surround his face. He'll die he'll take 2d4 hit points of suffocation damage until he dies. And only magic or silver weapons affect it, so it's pretty tough. Okay, second page, The Land Kraken by David Taylor. And it says essentially it's like a giant squid, moves along like a slug. It has a shell it can retreat into, which is obviously very hard for it to hit. It's 12 hit dice monster, attacks with 8 different tentacles. David Taylor also has The False Troll. He says this is inspired by certain insects that try to look like other creatures. So this is a 3 hit dice creature with no strength, no regeneration, but looks like a troll. Will try to scare. Its tactic is to try and sort of scare you, make you think it's a troll so that you run away and sort of run you into some type of trap that it has set up nearby, since it doesn't want to actually fight you itself. And if you do come after it, it's going to run. If you charge it or whatever, then it will run away. The Bloody Bones is an undead creature by JLT Patterson. So it looks like a skeleton with bits of flesh or blood dripping off of it, sometimes in chains. It gets turned as a wraith and has a special attack. It's 5 hit dice monster. When it hits you, you take a -1 on your hits, on your strength, and your dexterity, on your damage, and on your saving throws. It hits you again, now you've got a -2 on all those things. Hits you again, now you got a -3 on all those things, and does 1d6 damage. It also says you have to save versus fear or flee when you first see it. It doesn't say whether the special attack is permanent. That seems pretty severe to me, although some of those, like level drain type things, right, that undead can do to you are permanent. So I guess it's a DM. Depends on whether you want to tune up or tune down this monster. You can have that be permanent, or you can have that last for, X, maybe D10 rounds or something like that. Certainly the players wouldn't know that until their strength, etc., returned. The last one is Simon Robbins' contribution. It's called The Mannequin. It is essentially a low-level golem made of wax or flesh, and essentially their attack is to hit you and then sort of mold their body part, probably their hand or arm, around your face to cause suffocation. And the only way you're going to get that off is probably through burning, which is likely to cause permanent burn to the character who's having this thing melted off of it, right? So only 3 to 4 hit dice, or maybe it's 3/4 of a hit dice, I think is what that's supposed to mean. Oh no, okay. 3 for wax, 4 for flesh, or vice versa. They don't really say. Would be the hit dice. And yeah, so those are the new monsters, things that go bump in the night. The character file we mentioned before it's been at the back of every one of these Demonsblood fanzines. These are all from John Norris, and what I liked about it was that they were all related to some type of low quality tavern. And so he's got lots of sort of background and information. He's got the innkeeper, a bouncer, a drunk, a pimp, a couple prostitutes. What else does he have here? A couple noblemen. I'm not sure why they're hanging out at this tavern. The card shark. He calls it a card sharp. Maybe that's an English thing. A trader, a couple soldiers, members of the town watch, and some type of charlatan. So very good way of sort of fleshing out your tavern here all in one place. That's it for Demonsblood number 3, the third one in this series. As I mentioned before, there are 7 of these. I have 6, so unless I can find number 6, which is the one I'm missing, by the time we get there, I guess we'll have to come back to it later someday when I track it down. Hope you guys are enjoying these videos. Hope you're enjoying the series and my channel. I hope you all are subscribed, and hope you'll ask your friends to give us a look, and maybe they will join the subscriptions as well. Until next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.